Good morning, everybody. Good to be here. My name is Decorte. I am the director of all things Claris at Soliant Consulting, so happy to be here. We're going to talk about choices we have when we're building solutions. And specifically, we're going to exchange some ideas on how I see that we now can and probably should architect things differently than we have in the past. And there's context to why this is important to me, and I think important to all of us. And it's sort of born out of pain. A lot of suffering solutions are brought to my doorstep. At Soliant, we touch about 600 projects every year, and I get personally involved in about 80 of those in any given year, really. And a lot of these projects that I have to work on, unfortunately, are the kind of where we're trying to put lipstick on a pig, right? They're the kind of solutions where they have grown organically and they become a performance dog, or there's just things that are wrong with them. And trying to undo that can be really expensive, right? Because the client already paid for the solution. The client thinks that their solution is functionally complete. It just doesn't deliver the stability or the performance that they're after. So trying to convince a client to spend a lot of money undoing things to get them back to the place that they think they already are, that's very, very difficult to do, right? It's very tough to convince a client to do that. And unfortunately, that's also the place where the client will then, or is at risk of drawing some conclusions that FileMaker isn't a platform for them, right? Because clearly FileMaker cannot do what they set out to do. And it's really not FileMaker that is at fault, right? It's the architectural thinking of trying to do things with FileMaker where potentially, and then we'll get to that, we can do things slightly differently when we build these things. It's also the reason why I tend to get a little pushy on the forums, the community forums, when it comes to best practices, right? I think best practices really are the distilled pain of a lot of developers into somewhat simple rules of thumb, really, that we can follow. We don't have to follow them. I'll mention that a few times. There are no dogmas. This is not me preaching that you should do things a certain way. But best practices are there to make you think, right? At least you can think about it. If you then decide to deviate from the best practices, that's fine, right? But at least you've given it some consideration. And that's really all that I'm after here. So because of all that pain that is being brought to my doorstep, I do have very strong opinions about some of these things, right? And I'm not saying that I'm wrong. I'm not saying that I'm right. I just want you to think about these things and take certain, maybe new things for you into consideration when you're building these things. And you may think, like best practices, is there a simple way, is there a simple strategy that will always work, that will always make sure that whatever you build is going to be stable and performant? Well, no, right? It doesn't work that way. There's way too many variables involved. But at least we can think about some of these things as we go forward. There are a couple of trends that I want to share with you before we get to the meat of the presentation, because they're relevant, right? It's the kind of trends that we see in our industry and around us that can cause us to think differently a little bit about these things. And the first one is this. We used to be able to defend our resources that we have because all the users were in a central place, right? They were going to an office and they were working. So you could get away with defending at the perimeter of wherever your network was, right? And so the moat around that castle really are things like border routers, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, firewalls, all of these things. Now it's a little different, right? Our users are everywhere, and they have this expectation that they can use any device to consume whatever resources that you have available at your office. So the identity has become the new frontier, right? That's the new border. You need to be able to know exactly who that user is that is trying to access your resources. And you cannot assume that the user is at your premises when they do that. They can be anywhere. So that identity as the new perimeter is really important. And OneLogin has a great infographic there that sort of showcases where we come from and where we're going with that, right? So authentication used to be the simple thing where it's a username and a password. It has evolved to more complex, where two-factor authentication, multiple factor of authentication, where it's not just that secret that you know, but it's also something that you have, something that you are, that is involved in authenticating, so that whoever controls the resource knows that it is really you who is trying to access that. This is where we are currently, where there's a lot more contextual authentication, right? Time of day, the device, day of the week, that kind of thing, that is all factored into will you be allowed to access that resource? And we're going to a place where we all have phones with us. It's not going to be you who's going to be asked to authenticate, right? The question is going to be asked of your phone, because your phone knows how you walk. Your phone knows how you talk, right? Your phone right now knows that it's in your possession, right? So the question is not going to be you, and you're not going to be asked to provide a secret. The question is going to be asked of something like your phone. So that is a big trend, and we'll have to keep that in mind. The other one is one that we've seen recently. We all know how hard it is to deal with big IT companies, right? They have requirements, they have opinions, they will make you do certain things, and usually that involves some complexity. What we're finding now is that even a lot of the smaller companies are outsourcing their IT, and the companies that they outsource IT to now behave like big IT, right? Because they're bigger IT shops than individually that you had at those companies. And that translates into more requirements. We will be asked to be in lockstep with whatever they have in mind when it comes to authentication or other things, right? So it's a trend that we're seeing, and it makes it harder to deal with these smaller companies even, right? We come from a place that we didn't have to defend ourselves when we had a solution and we wanted to provide that solution to the clients. Now we'll have to explain what FileMaker is to these bigger IT shops. And this is another trend. Collectively, we've been already doing a lot of these, right? So instead of doing everything in FileMaker, we are already integrating with a lot of other systems. Whether we do it directly, we do it to connect. The make or buy decision for these is simple, right? And we are integrating with these because we see them for what they are. These are solved problems, right? We don't need to write an accounting system. We'll just integrate whatever accounting system is out there. The same with any of these. So as FileMaker developers, we are already on the path of integration, much more than we have in the past, right? Like 5 to 10 years ago, this wasn't the case, but now it is. And this is sort of the essence of what I want to share with you today, because if we take it one step further, what if we have certain pieces of functionality inside our FileMaker solution that we could potentially take out, right? I'm not talking about taking out the accounting part of your FileMaker solution, but let's see if there's functionality that we are now doing in FileMaker because we can. Maybe we can not do that in FileMaker, but still have FileMaker at the core and then integrate with that. And this is definitely in play, right? This is something that is true for all of us. We tend to rely on information that is already familiar with us, for us, right? We tend to go looking for answers in the places that are familiar to us, instead of going with something that is totally new for us, right? So another way to express that is if all we have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail, right? And that's true for everybody anywhere, but certainly for us as FileMaker developers, right? If we're given a problem, we will tend to try and solve it with FileMaker. And that can get in our way. So we'll have to keep that in mind. And there's also the fear of missing out. Some of that is true with AI. We talk to a lot of customers, and we have a lot of customers who want to get into the AI, not so much because they have a use case for it, but they think that they should, right? The flip side of that is fear of joining in. And we see some of that in our own developers at Soliant. When we talk about things like microservices and JavaScript, and they go like, yeah, no, not familiar, uncomfortable, don't want to go there, right? So that's a thing, right? We need to keep that in mind. There is an antidote for that, right? There's a way that we can combat that a little bit, and I like this saying. Because we already, every single one of us here is smart enough to absorb new skills, right? We've learned everything that we know about the FileMaker platform, and that's not a small feat, right? So clearly we can we can learn. That's a gift that we have. And we've also mastered this, right? We've learned to learn. We are in technology, it's always changing, and we go with the flow. We can take that, we can tackle that. The one thing that I'm going to push on a little bit today is the last one, right? The willingness to go there, to discover something new, that is often a hurdle, right? So I really like the saying, and I use it a lot internally, and I didn't invent that. I borrowed that from Mr. Herbert there, but it's true. And there's one more thing that we tend to overlook often, right? That is an afterthought way too much. That is thinking about these things: disaster recovery, business continuity. We tend to think as developers, and I wrote a blog post about that about 10 years ago, and I've opened many DEF CON sessions with that same question, right? We're good developers, but are we good deployers? The answer isn't always yes, right? This is hugely important for our clients, right? Our clients pay us to do development, but really our clients get the most value out of their solution after we're done developing, right? For the years that they can use that solution. We tend to be somewhat narrowly focused on the development cycle of this whole thing. But if we develop something and it's not performant, it crashes all the time, then the client really doesn't get value out of what we build. So that's really not a good thing. I did a follow-up post on that not too long ago, beginning of the year. Because I see this often, right? As developers, we build something, then it gets deployed and it crashes, and go like, yep, not my problem, right? Well, I tend to think that it is our problem, right? Because we are in the value delivery business, right? We're not in the building technology things. We're here to solve problems so that the client can use those. And keep in mind, I've mentioned it before, there really are no dogmas, right? So there's not a single way of doing this thing. There's no right or wrong. There's just things to consider. So meet the monolith, right? I'll define the monolith in two different ways as we go along. The first way that I'll define it is a FileMaker solution that is built as a single file, right? Like cramming everything into a single FileMaker file. That is one way to define the monolith. The other one is similar, but it could be multiple files, but it's making FileMaker do everything, right? Where maybe it shouldn't do everything. The end result very often is that you end up with a turd, right? It's that's when it comes when the clients bring it to me and say, can you fix it? So we want to avoid getting there. When I said there's no dogmas, there is not a guarantee that by thinking about or adopting some of these approaches that you'll end up in heaven, right? So there's a good chance that you'll end up with something like this. All right, there'll be smaller turds, but still turds, right? Or you may be thinking, my solution is already perfect. There's really no need for me to think about some of these things and breaking it up, either functionally or otherwise. Or is there, right? Maybe this is a better way to end up with your solution, right? So even if you have a solution that currently doesn't display problems, maybe by future-proofing it a little bit or thinking about it a little differently, you can make it even better. All right. And like I said, I'll repeat it once more. There really is no right or wrong, right? Sometimes a monolith is exactly what you need. Sometimes it's the absolute worst thing that you can build. Just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Yes, you can cram 1 million tables in a FileMaker file. The FileMaker file can be 8 terabytes. Yeah, please don't do that, right? Because at the end of the day, what makes us good, right? As developers, what is it that we can bring to the table? As a software engineer, it's all about options, right? You need to know how you can approach things. And there's always many different ways that you can approach it, right? So I want my people working for me, I want them to consider before they started building, right? So that the choice is a deliberate one, that we can document the choices, we can document the assumptions, we know why we're building it the way that we're building it. Instead of being surprised at the end, like, holy crap, we got this big file here and it's not working really great. I want us to be deliberate. Right? We need to be able to build a proof of concept on some of these things. So those are the skills that I want my people to have when we set out to build a solution for our clients. Right? So if we have a monolith, and this is where we get to the two different places, right? So part one is about the monolith as a single FileMaker file, right? So we have a complete FileMaker solution. It's in a single file. For some of the functionality that we can't do with FileMaker natively, we turn to plugins. And mind you, this is not a knock on plugins. Christian's plugin we use it. It's one of the greatest plugins out there. We just need to keep in mind that everything we do in FileMaker, you have to wait for the result, right? It's a synchronous operation, everything that you do, and plugins are not a difference there. Very often you end up with something like this, right? And this is actually not the worst file that we have on there, but you end up with a file that is multiple gigabytes big, and it has consequences, right? There are a couple of things that we miss out on when we do that, right? Every time that you write something, every time that you try to write something to that file or even read from that file, FileMaker is going to delegate the locking of that file to the operating system. So it behaves somewhat differently on all of the operating systems, but there's a tax for that, right? Like, because it's a single binary file, it's a physical file, right? That file will get locked for certain operations. And that means that some of these operations will have to wait for each other. They will go on a queue if you have enough of those. So if you put enough load on these things, you're building yourself a funnel where you may not be aware that you're doing that. For many years, FileMaker Server has been able to do hard linking for backups, right? If you have a monolith, you get none of that benefits. That 60 gig file, if I change one character in one field on one record, the next backup run, FileMaker has to find 60 gigs worth of disk space for that one character that I just changed, right? And it has to expend the resources, the time, to write a 60 gig file. So we don't want to do that. Same with parallel backups. If you have a single file, there's no way that you can use that new feature that we have in FileMaker Server with parallel backups. Restores will become slower. If you ever had to sit through a consistency check on a 60 gig file, you know how painful that is. So that's another reason not to do that. Deployments will be slower, right? We have a blog post about that. We build a tool around the data migration tool, which is a command line tool, so it's perfect for scripting. We built some logic around that so that it can look at a folder of your solution. It can figure out which are the biggest files and then spin up concurrent data migration sessions for each of those files so that you can get through to your total data migration much faster than if you had a single file. So that's one of those. And we know that Claris is working on a patch tool, so we think we can do some of that as well. And of course, if everything is one file, it's very difficult to share some of that code with other solutions that you may be running on that same server, right? A quick word on parallel backups, if you're not familiar with that. FileMaker Server backs up files sequentially, right? Starts with file 1 all the way through file 6. So your backup run will take as long as it takes to get through these 6 files. The parallel backup feature that is newish in FileMaker Server, FileMaker Server will try to figure out which files logically belong together in the sense that they get their changes at the same time, right? So transactions, not transactions since 1906, but transactions in general. If files get transactions at the same time, FileMaker Server will group those files. We have no control over those groups, right? So FileMaker Server decides that. So it's a bit of an adaptive process. But FileMaker can now run backups across these groups in parallel, right? So within the group, the backup is still sequentially, but FileMaker can back up more of these groups of files at the same time. End result is your backup run is much faster than before. So that's there, right? And of course, there's counter arguments to make, right? So there are certain benefits that you get from cramming everything into a single file. So these are some of the ones that we see the most often, right? You miss out on the fact that you'll have to duplicate some of that functionality, right? Your custom functions, your accounts, your custom menus. If you have multiple files, you have to create those in every single file. And that is often the argument for putting everything into a single file. I'll push back on some of these, right? So for the privilege sets, I don't think that's a really big issue, right? Because you need to craft your privilege sets to the tables that they belong to, the data that's there, right? So it's really not much difference if you need to create different privilege sets for different files because those are different tables anyway there. And certainly for the accounts, right? the FileMaker platform is actually great at using different identity stores, right? For me, it makes absolutely no sense at all, to have FileMaker be its own identity provider. And that goes back to some of these trends that I mentioned at the beginning. If you're working with bigger organizations or even smaller organizations with outsourced IT, they will be asking for this, right? And this also speaks to that trend where the identity is the new parameter, right? The identity is so important these days. You don't want to be in control of that, right? Just delegate that to an identity provider and you'll inherit so many features that you'll get from that. Multi-factor authentication, can't do it with FileMaker accounts, right? But you can with these. You get compliance reports, governance reports, all of the things that these identity providers provide, you'll inherit for free when you use them. This is not an exhaustive list here, but these are just all the ones that we've already used at Soliant for some of our clients, right? So FileMaker Server is great at that. So when we're talking about breaking up that single massive FileMaker file into multiple FileMaker files, so that's really what we're talking about here, is we want to be looking for those break lines where we can break the solution up. We've all done or considered things like data separation. That's not really what I'm talking about here, right? Because data separation, you can still have one UI file and one massive data file. I'm talking about finding the ways to split your files up so that you'll get the best performance, right? If you have one or more tables that receive most of the writes to your file, right? It would make sense to split that table up into its own physical file. Classic examples would be any audit logging that you do, right? Because if you have a solution that spans a lot of functionality, but you're logging everything into a single table, that is going to be one of your pain points, right? Your users may be working in different parts of the file and updating different tables, but if you're collecting all that data into a single log file, that's potentially going to be painful. Same thing with thinking about that disaster recovery and business continuity, right? Which parts of the functionality are the most crucial for your clients, right? Maybe break those up into their own files so that you can restore them more quickly. Maybe you can restore parts of your solution if you need to, right? What is the absolute minimum that your client needs to get through their work, and then break up your solution that way. And also, like I mentioned, maybe there is some shared code that you want to use across solutions. Maybe break that out there as well. All right. Now that we've done that, let's take it a step further. And this speaks to the part where we were thinking about when we have this whole solution, our FileMaker solution there, and it could potentially be one or more files. But and this speaks to what I said. We are getting much better at thinking about integrations, right? So for most of us, making API calls from inside FileMaker isn't a mystery. And FileMaker is actually very good with its functionality that it has to allow us to do that. So this is where we would try to think about pieces of functionality that we have in FileMaker that maybe we can consider not doing in FileMaker or not using the FileMaker toolset for that. Right? So what if we built that functionality outside of FileMaker in any tech stack of our choosing, right? But in the form of something that we can call like it was an API. And we would do that because it's either some functionality that doesn't exist in FileMaker or that does exist in FileMaker, but it's not very performant or it's not scalable. So those would be the things that we look for as we're looking at that stuff. And of course, if you build something out as a microservice, you can call that microservice from anywhere, right? It doesn't have to be from another FileMaker solution. It could be from a web app or anything like that, much more easily. But we'll stick to just the stuff that we have in FileMaker, right? And this is meant specifically to tackle that big complaint that I mentioned up front, where we get complaints from users to say, we're building out this solution, but now we're adding more modules, more functionality, we're adding more users, we have another location that we want to bring online. And this is where they think FileMaker isn't the tool for us, right? Like whatever we do, we're already taxing our server. We don't see any room to grow with our solution, so we have to abandon the FileMaker platform and go to something else, which, as we all know, is not a trivial thing to do. It's really expensive. I think we don't need to take our customers there. I think there's a lot of middle ground that we can do where they can leave the core of what they do, the things that are unique to their workflows, we can leave that in FileMaker. But the things that really are solved problems, just like the APIs that we integrate with that are solved problems, we can find those solved problems and do those not in FileMaker. A couple of use cases. And these are things that we have already done along these lines, right? PDF generation. We recently worked with a huge client in the medical space, and their biggest complaint was performance. Their solution just wasn't performant. And we tracked it down to basically just a few things functionality-wise. They had about 250 concurrent users on their FileMaker system. And the thing where it bogged down was they were generating massive numbers of PDFs throughout the day. The generation of a PDF, FileMaker is good at it, right? You build your layout, you output it as a PDF. But outputting a PDF or generating a PDF doesn't need to be done in FileMaker. There's great libraries that do that. You just send it the data, create a little microservice that does that, send it the data, and it'll generate the PDF for you, right? So we're not taking critical things out of FileMaker with this. We're just taking some utility out of FileMaker and doing it that way. Same with having to parse through JSON. FileMaker has great JSON functions. They're not the fastest, especially not if you need to deal with massive amount of JSON, or if you want to do semi-complex queries on that, right? There are libraries like JSONata that are great at answering questions, right? You can almost write, it's not quite SQL code, but you can write your queries against JSON and have them executed in lightning speed with these things, right? So again, this wouldn't be a critical piece that you take out of FileMaker, but it could be something that will get you great performance, right? So that one thing that slows down your solution for your users, the thing that they gripe about, you can take that out. We do the same thing with XML to JSON and JSON to XML conversions, right? We still need to interact with systems that require XML or give us XML. We tend to prefer JSON, so often we want to convert those two. If you wonder what it takes to create an endpoint and an API that does that, that's all that you need to do. And really, it's just line 8 there, right, where I'm doing the .json XML. I take an XML, I'll tell JavaScript, make JSON out of it, and you're done, right? This is fast. This is very lightweight, not rocket science, and this is in the form of a post endpoint to a Node.js Express API. So these things are simple to do, and this goes to pretty much any format conversion that you want to do: CSV to JSON, JSON to CSV, Excel file generation. So all of these things. The other thing that we use our approach for very often is anything that has to generate scenarios of things, right? Where you have to iterate through massive, or you have to iterate many times through a certain set of data to come up with different scenarios or do simulations and stuff like that, right? FileMaker isn't a computational powerhouse. It never has been, and it probably never will be, and that's fine, right? It doesn't mean that we need to go look elsewhere. We can still build our things in FileMaker, but if we have a semi-complex thing, we can then choose to not do that in FileMaker. And we do the same thing with anything that is more complex text manipulations than what FileMaker can do, right? If we're giving HTML, we need the text of that. Regular expressions, right, is a classic example of some of these things. We do that for OCR as well, especially if it's OCR that has to have some artificial intelligence built into that. Things like sentiment analysis, even barcode and QR code generation, right? FileMaker does it. We can do it faster with more choices. And again, I'm not saying that anytime you come across one of these, you have to not do that in FileMaker. It's just we choose to at least consider not doing it in FileMaker, especially under load, right? If this is the thing that is holding back your solution, by doing it in by not doing it in FileMaker, we can make it faster. We can also scale that, right? Because now we're talking about standard tools, Linux server, Node.js Express. We can scale that horizontally, we can scale that vertically much more easily than we can, right? And then of course there's the big thing, right? It's very hard to do things asynchronously in FileMaker. We have the perform script on server with no waits. We now have the perform script on server with callback that allows us to do things in an async fashion, and that's great. But you're still taxing your FileMaker server, right? At the end of the day, you're still taxing your FileMaker solution by doing that. If you throw massive a massive amount of perform script on server to your FileMaker server, you could be impacting users that are doing other things in FileMaker, right? So the ability to start a job somewhere else and then have that job talk back when it's done is hugely favorable. It's a massively good thing to have in our solutions. Another big use case where we do some of these things is if whatever we're trying to integrate with has their own SDK or software development kit, because they've already written a lot of the code for us, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel there. Yes, we could, and I'm going to give the example of S3, which is Amazon Web Services object storage. We can make all those calls, right? Their API is documented. You can just go read it. You can make all of these calls from inside FileMaker, not a problem at all. But it's so much easier if you don't. If you use their SDK, you can make it simpler. And really, a quick example of that is in your solution, you would have an environments file where you keep your secrets. Basically, just an identifier and a key. And then in JavaScript, it's really as simple as that, right? You basically use their SDK to say, create me a new client, and you feed it those things, and that's done, right? Most of the API integrations, and you'll agree with me, they start with having to authenticate against the API, and that's very often that's the most difficult part. Once you get through that, they give you a token, and then you're good. The rest of the API calls usually are simple, right? If you ever try to make API calls to authenticate against AWS, you'll know exactly what I mean. So this is all it takes in JavaScript, right? There's no authentication really because the SDK does that for us. And if we then need to restore an object from S3, from Glacier, for instance, then really this is all the code that we need, right? And it's really the first line where I ask for the new restore object command, and then the third line where I send that command off and I'm done. Right? That's as simple as it gets. And yes, you'll have to get through the learning curve of learning about their SDK and all of that, right? So there is something to learn, but really it's the same amount, probably less, than the learning curve you would have of trying to read all the API documentation of AWS and trying to make sense of that and doing all of that from inside FileMaker, right? So you can make your development cycles faster by doing that. All right. So when we're thinking about taking out pieces of functionality from our solution, from our FileMaker solution, we're not thinking about using full-blown services like QuickBooks or any of those services, right? It's really about pieces of functionality that we say, does there exist a library somewhere in JavaScript or Python or whatever your tech stack is that you want to do that does that, right? So we're talking about finding libraries really that do some of these things. I'm also not talking about consuming webhooks. This is really just we're inside FileMaker, we're trying to offload some functionality to something else. But if you're interested in webhooks, which is the flip side, right? There's some other service needs to talk to us and give us some information. There's the Claris Engage session that has a really good overview of what webhooks are all about. But in this case, we're really talking about looking for those pieces of functionality that exist in FileMaker that we can not do in FileMaker. So hopefully by this point you're at least semi-interested in at least considering that. And the rest of the journey I thought was interesting, right? Because what is stopping us from going there? And when we discussed this within Soliant, we thought that, and clearly it's not the FileMaker part of that, right? Because we already consume a lot of APIs, so we know inside FileMaker how to use the insert from URL script step with all of the curl options to call any API. We're familiar enough with that. So we thought that the thing that was holding us back was people having to learn JavaScript, right? And turns out that wasn't the problem. The problem really is all the practical stuff, right? You need to build whatever that is. You need to be able to do that quickly on your machine, right? Because you're not going to spin up a Linux server just so that you can do some tests. You want to do that on this machine here, on this laptop. So you need to build it. You need to be able to run it. You need to be able to debug it. So that was the thing that was holding back our developers. JavaScript you can pick up, right? You can Google for code. You can ask ChatGPT if you really want to. But you can find code examples, right? You can find tutorials. That's not the problem. The problem was mechanically, how do we put this together And then once we have it, how do we deploy that? Right? When we're done, how are we going to deploy that and maintain that and all of these things? So those were the stumbling blocks for people to adopt that more widely. Right? So let's talk about that a little bit. What does that look like, right? So when you have a microservice, say that you use Node.js, that's what we use, right? Because it makes a lot of sense. You can use any tech stack that you want, but it would make sense to use JavaScript because there's a lot of synergies with other things that we do in the FileMaker space. So a microservice really, it's a small web server, right? At the end of the day, so when we talk about web servers, we think about the big three that we come across every single day, but we'll come back to that later. So in its simplest form, it's a web server that sits there listening for some things and then returns something, right? That's the essence of a microservice. And the part in the middle where it's doing stuff, that's where you have to decide on your tech stack, right? What technology are you going to use to write the code that actually does something? We tend to use JavaScript because it makes sense for us. All right. So how do you build the stuff to begin with? Like I said, pick your tech stack. Right? If you want to use Python, use Python. If you want to use anything that you can use, or if you want to use Ruby, that's possible too. .NET, it doesn't really matter. But we pick JavaScript. And if you pick JavaScript, then it makes sense to go with Node.js as the engine. Right? Node.js is really nothing more than an engine that can execute JavaScript. That's really all that there is. And then there's a framework called Express. There's other ones as well. That will give you all the scaffolding that you need to create an active web server that can listen all of that. Basically frees you up so that you can focus on writing the pieces of code that you want to write and not have to worry about really the web server part of that. Right? And there's alternatives. We talked about some of these, or I think yesterday it came up. There's Node-RED, there's N8N. That can make that part even simpler for you, all right? You forgo some benefits potentially like scalability and all of these things, but as a way to get going, and if you're visually inclined in building, then Node-RED is perfect for that. We use it too. But really, you're going to be using Visual Studio Code for your code writing, right? That's the default IDE for some of these things. There's other ones depending on the tech stack that you want to use, but Visual Studio Code it is for us. Right? So say that you've just written some code there in JavaScript and you're using the Express framework so you can run it. Right? So running that as a developer, because that's what we're talking about here, right? We're not at the stage yet where we want to deploy this. We're just trying to figure out proof of concept maybe. Would it work if I not did do that in FileMaker so that I can call, I need to write something that I can call from inside FileMaker. Again, Visual Studio Code is great for that, right? So you have a bit of code there. And if you're using Express, then it really is that simple command there, npm start, and it'll basically run your web server for you right there on your machine, right? And what it means is then from Postman or from inside FileMaker, you can just hit your local host, whatever port you use in your code, and test it. Right? So that's how you can run and test this on your machine locally very easily. You stay within that tool set that you have, which is Visual Studio Code, to run all of that. All right. That sort of limits you to testing against your own machine, right? So sometimes you may want to have another developer or maybe from your client side. The tool that we use for that is ngrok, because that builds a tunnel from your machine. What it does is, this is the command to do, it's a little small there, but you call ngrok, you give it a host name and a port that it will listen on, and what it'll do for you, it'll create a tunnel that is reachable from the outside, right? So you don't need to fiddle with your firewall, because you don't want to accidentally open your firewall and then forget to close it back down again. Using a tunneling service makes that easy, because it's your machine making the connection, then goes out. That's how the tunnel gets open. So you don't need to fiddle with your firewall at all. But it gives you an HTTP and an HTTPS endpoint that you can reach from anywhere in the world, right? It'll still go to your machine, right? So we still didn't need to deploy this somewhere so that we can reach it from the outside, right? So this will get you a long, long way in testing some of these things, right? So before you even have to consider. And it has a really great UI for seeing the incoming calls and some of the metrics around that, right? So it's a great tool. You can get it for free. You can pay for some extra features, but it's a great one. All right. So say that you've written some of the code and you tested it on your machine, you're happy. So now you have to start thinking about deploying that thing. And this is usually where things become somewhat more difficult, right? So from a skill sets point of view, this is where there's a diversion between us as developers and us as deployers. And I don't expect most of us even to become proficient at some of the things that I mentioned here. This is where typically you can get far with just fiddling and testing some of these things, but when you need to have something that is scalable and secure, this is typically where you'd have to get some help from people that do this for a living. But there's this great tool called PM2, Process Manager 2. It's free. You can run that on Windows, you can run it on Linux. I typically, when we do these things, we don't do them on Mac OS, because that does make a lot of sense to us, because most servers that we deal with are either Windows or Linux at this point. But this is a great way to run that. What it really does is it's a simple tool that you install, and then you tell it to basically wrap around your Node.js application, right? So it'll run it for you, just like we did with that npm start from Visual Studio Code. It's the same thing, but it does that with production grade robustness, if you will, right? And it even has some scalability built into it. If you get a certain threshold of requests to that microservice, it can spin up multiple versions of it automatically at the same time, right? And you don't pay for this tool, actually. It's a great tool. So it'll do that. Of course, when you run that, it'll run on that port that you specified, right? Whether you pick port 3000 or 17,000, doesn't really matter. The next thing to consider in deployment very often is, okay, I got my code running. It's scalable, it's robust, it's fine as it is, but now I need to reach it from the outside, right? One of the things you can do that, every FileMaker server is a Node.js server, right? FileMaker server under the hood uses a lot of Node.js. So if you don't want to install Node.js, you could add your microservice to your FileMaker server. You got a best practice here. You got to consider that carefully, right? If it's a microservice that needs to run when your FileMaker server isn't running, then don't put it on your FileMaker server. Also, consider the load, right? Because we started this journey by being concerned about the load that our FileMaker server has to deal, right? Then sometimes it wouldn't make sense to add whatever we wrote to take the load of FileMaker server to put it on FileMaker server, right? But you could if you wanted to. We typically don't. Because a Linux server that can run these things, these are tiny servers, right? Of course, you have to factor in whatever scale that you need to achieve with this, but typically a very low-end Linux server will do just fine and will be very performant for some of these things. When you talk about reachability, right? If there is if you put this in the cloud, you don't need to. You can run all of these things on premise, right? So nothing that I've shown here today to this point is specific to the cloud, right? You can run all of this on premise. But if you want it to be reachable, you can continue to use one of the big web servers, right? Because your clients already will have a web server somewhere, whether it's Apache or Nginx or IIS. So you can use that one. And what that really means is reverse proxying. Right? If you're not familiar with reverse proxying, FileMaker server already does a lot of that. Right? If you ever looked at, this is IIS by the way, if you looked at the FileMaker website, you'll find that there's a lot of reverse proxying that FileMaker server does for the admin console, for the web publishing parts, a lot of the stuff there. So you can certainly add your own stuff to that. And do that, right? What it really means is that all the requests will hit the IIS or the Nginx or the Apache web server, and then will be forwarded to your web server. So you can move your web service, your microservice around to anywhere that you want. The address of where it can be reached will always be the same thing, right? So this is an Nginx configuration there. This is a slide from an old Engage presentation that I did when we introduced Linux Server, and I mentioned that in the future we'll be thinking about containerization Fabrice, who is here, already does a lot of that for FileMaker Server. We do some of that with Saline internally as well, right? Because what it really means is that when you deploy your microservice in the future, you can already do it now, but in the future, certainly, we won't be installing it on individual machines, right? We will not spin up a Linux server to install our microservice. We'll do that in a container image, and then we'll have something that will run our containers. And really, running containers and orchestration traffic between containers, that's what Kubernetes is all about, or Kates, if you want. If you wonder about the 8, there's 8 characters between the K and the S. I don't know who comes up with that kind of stuff, but that's what they call it. Canonical, who makes Ubuntu, is very big in that space. It's one of the reasons why Claros went with Ubuntu. They're a very big player. They have a thing called microkates, which makes it very lightweight to install Kubernetes so that you can orchestrate your Dockers there. Now, there's a risk there that if we start building microservices that we will add, we'll be tempted to add a lot of functionality to our microservice, right? Our microservice can become a monolith in its own right? The future for these things is really is this, right? Where we write a particular function that does one thing, right? Say that XML to JSON conversion, right? That's a simple function. We will deploy that so that this function can be executed. And you may be going, yeah, that's AWS Lambda, right? That's what that does. And Google has the same, and Azure has those as well. And maybe thinking, yep, there we go, right? Cloud. You don't need to have the cloud for that, right? There's the thing called open files. File stands for functions as a service. It's the wave of the future. You can deploy this on-prem. That's actually free. It's open source. We use all the time. If you wonder what that looks like, I have an example in a slide here. So microkates, even Amazon knows that this container orchestration thing is important. So you can actually download what Amazon uses to run on-premise, right? So that's an alternative to that OpenFast thing. That even Amazon understands that on-premise, and we mentioned this yesterday as well. On-premise is important, right? Not every client wants to go to the cloud, can go to the cloud. So everything that we think about here is not cloud specific, right? We can do all of that stuff on-premise to OpenFAS and other things. This is what it looks like. This is OpenFAS, where you basically say, okay, where's my Docker image of that one function that I have? It's really as simple as you go to Visual Studio Code, you write your one function. Inside Visual Studio, you can already deploy it as a Docker image, right? So it takes a lot of the stuff and the magic out of there. And then when you're done, you get a function, right? You get a URL, and that URL calls your function. That's as simple as it gets. That was my series of. I deploy these internally as Raspberry Pis. Right? They're cheap. If they fail, I throw them away. I put a new one in place. I have 3 of them because they basically are self-healing, which is a great feature of Kubernetes. So you get load balancing and all of that stuff. There's a simpler version of OpenFAS called FASD. You basically forego some of that scalability when you use that, but it's a great way to play with that. So I would certainly encourage you to look at that. Speeding up a little bit because we're running out of time, but we're coming to the end anyway. So this is how I think we can think about architecting FileMaker solutions, right? So instead of trying to cram everything into a single FileMaker file or do all of the functionality inside FileMaker and supplement it with plugins, we can consider using microservices for some of the heavy-duty lifting, the things that are computationally heavy, things that things like JavaScript can make a lot faster, so that our FileMaker solution as a whole, the thing that we deliver to our clients, can remain extremely performant and robust and have the best possible uptime. And in the future, we'll be thinking about deploying individual functions instead of microservices, right? So just like looking for those breakpoints when we break up a single FileMaker file into multiple FileMaker files, these would be some of the questions that we ask ourselves, right? So what are some of the solved problems? What are some of the libraries out there that exist that do some of the things we would otherwise do in FileMaker, right? Think PDF generation, some of these things. And then look for things that obviously would perform better than what FileMaker does. And certainly, because we're now using standard functionality that everybody else in the world uses, you get that scalability, right? You just inherit scalability without having to do much of anything at all. You don't have to write code for scalability because you can deploy these things to be scalable. So, like I said, solve problems here are not the kind like full-blown services that are out there that you can use, but look for these things that are specialized libraries. All right, we're coming to the end. So if you remember just one thing from my session today is don't let your solution, the solution that your clients use every day, when they derive value from using it every day, don't let it become a turd, right? Just be on the lookout for that because you have options, right? So you have options to consider different ways of doing the same thing. So, so thank you. Do we have any questions?
I have one simple question.
Sure.
How much do you charge per hour?
Less than you think.
Do we have any more questions, or else you can just, oh, whole bunch here. We grab a few, and then you just run up to Wim anytime here.
It's not really a question, it's only I would like to understand if in our team, one of the problems is try to work many people on the same project. And I assume that your, let's say, technology, the way to really try to work on a project, in this case, in a different microservices, is really good because you can prepare your team in order to really work on different microservices. And this is one of the point that FileMaker is very, let's say, is very difficult, that is make a group of people working in the same project, you know, in the same file, as far as you work in the same file. So do you think that, because you don't mention in your talk, that is also a good point to say that working on micro project can divide your project on different, let's say, parts, so different people can work together more efficiently?
Yep, it's a really good point. Yes, because you can use all the standard workflows, right? So you put this in a version control, you can do branches and pull requests and have multiple people working on the same code at the same time. It is something that is extremely difficult to do and do well in FileMaker, and we face the same problem. We typically, our projects are of the bigger size, and we typically have 2-3 developers working on any one project at the same time. In FileMaker, it's not easy to do. You have to dance around tickets and make sure that people can work on different aspects of the same solution and not step on each other's toes. If you were to adopt something like that, you get the benefit of that a little easier, absolutely.
That was a great presentation, and I just wanted to know about over-optimization. You know, how do you, at what point do you decide this is the right process? At what point do you decide, you know, FileMaker is the right tool for this? I don't want to add all these extra services that I have to manage, take care of, document.
Yep, a great question, absolutely. And we have these conversations all the time, and often we start by doing everything in FileMaker, right? But we try to have these conversations early on, right? Where we try to figure out what is that we're building. Some of these questions like, which ones of these exist elsewhere? And could we consider doing that? Maybe not now. Maybe the first release will be all FileMaker, but if we think that there will be a sufficient load, typically it's a question of load and scalability, right? Or pure performance. If you need to do a certain task and the client's appetite for waiting for a particular task isn't very great, that would be sort of like the decider, right? Where it's either going to be pure load or just pure the need for performance where we need to do this. But often we'll build the first prototype in FileMaker just so that we can get through the learning of exactly what we need to build. But have these conversations early on so that the choice to not do it in FileMaker is deliberate, and we can just factor that into the time that we need to allocate to the project and the budget, quite frankly. But premature optimization is a big thing, right? So we try not to fall in that trap by like I said, no dogmas. It's not because you can that you should. We try to incorporate that thinking early on that say, yeah, we could do this as microservice, but maybe there's really no need for that right now, right? So it takes conversations early on in the project to go about these things. And we like to document them in our wikis so that we have these conversations at any time we can go back and say, is it time to revisit this or are we fine?
So I think I got the last question, but things like Kubernetes and AWS Lambda are great because they have those self-healing processes that take care of themselves for availability. But there's always going to be a case when you have FileMaker at the core that there's the chance that it's unreachable for whatever reason. So can you give a brief overview about what you do as a failover for like if one of those microservices gets cut off or suddenly becomes unavailable, what do you do for your users?
Yep, great question, Mike. It really starts with monitoring, right? So you need to know when something goes down so that it's not your users telling you that something went down. So any FileMaker server deployment really will focus on knowing what is going on about that. And then sort of like related to Kate's question, we will ask the question, how bad is it if it goes down, right? Like how long, it's almost like the same questions for backups, right? How long can you be without that? And how critical is it to not be down? And then we can work backwards from that, because if the client says we absolutely cannot be down, or we cannot be down for more than 5 minutes, that basically dictates how much effort you need to put into making sure that it's self-healing, well monitored, all of that stuff. We like AWS for that reason, because everything is an API call, right? So you monitor something, it's down, you spin it right back up, right? Or you spin it up in a different region, stuff like that. So infrastructure as code, it really works for us. On-prem, it's the same thing. It's a little more difficult to do well because you physically have to buy the resources and the hardware to do it. But yeah, starts with monitoring and then using whatever tools that the infrastructure allows you to do that to spin them back up.
Perfect answer there. We're going to have to finish this session off so everyone had the time to leave and go to another one. Thank you very much, Wim.
Thanks.